Hello, thank you for joining us. We're going to wait just a few seconds for additional folks to jump on. You are here for tonight's webinar, Understanding Cardiomyopathy Genetic Therapies, Our Hope for the Future. We're very excited you could join us. We'll give people just a few more seconds here. I know it's a very busy time of year for folks, so we're just thrilled that so many folks could join us tonight. I'll just give you another few seconds. Excellent. Excellent. Welcome to tonight's webinar, Understanding Cardiomyopathy Genetic Therapies, Our Hope for the Future. I'm Jayanne Rock. I will be your host. I am the Director of Information and Education for the DCM Foundation and the Genetic Cardiomyopathy Awareness Consortium. Next slide, please. Again, thank you for joining. We'll begin in just a minute. We're letting additional folks join. While folks are joining, I just want to say I'm so excited. At last count, we had 429 people registered for tonight's webinar. So this is really a hot topic. People are so interested in understanding genetic therapies for cardiomyopathy and the future of those kind of therapies. So I think you'll find tonight fascinating. All microphones are on mute upon joining so that we can hear tonight's presenters. Next slide. If you would please submit your questions into the Q&A feature of Zoom at any time during the presentation. An open Q&A session will follow the presentation tonight, and we'll take questions at that time. Next. And behind the scenes, I have Justine assisting tonight. So Justine, thank you. Shout out to you. We'll do a quick poll tonight. We always like to know who is joining us for the webinar. Who is attending tonight's webinar? If you can just take a quick moment to answer the poll, if we can push the poll forward. Are you a cardiomyopathy patient, a family member or friend, a medical professional, or an industry professional? And we'll probably have a mix tonight because I know many cardiomyopathy patients and their family members are interested in this topic, but also, of course, medical and industry professionals to know what's going on in the industry. Oh, wonderful. Okay, so we have about 44% of folks are cardiomyopathy patients, another 15% are their family members. And then we have a split, another 15% or so are medical professionals, and about 27% are industry professionals. So that's fascinating. We hope that you enjoy tonight's webinar, and so let's get rolling. Next slide. Great, so tonight's topics. First, we're going to provide an overview about GCAC. That is the Genetic Cardiomyopathy Awareness Consortium, for those who don't know. Then we'll be doing some introductions. We have Wendy Borsari and Jeff Haraldson from Tanaya Therapeutics with us tonight, and they're going to talk about Genetics 101, the basics of gene therapy, an overview of gene therapy clinical trials, which is really fascinating, and then what Tenaya is doing in this space, and then we will take questions. Next slide. So first, let me provide an overview. Some of you may already know about the Genetic Cardiomyopathy Awareness Consortium, and for those who are new to this, we'll just provide a quick overview. Next slide. So the DCM Foundation has worked in partnership with 7 other U.S. cardiomyopathy patient support groups and a number of leading biopharma companies, Tenaya is one of them, to help bring awareness to the role of genetics in cardiomyopathy. We're all working together to help support this mission, which can save lives and advance therapies and treatments for cardiomyopathy. You can learn more at our website, geneticcardiomyopathy.org. Don't worry, you don't have to write anything down. I'm going to send an email tomorrow with all of these links and the webinar recording, so you'll have that information. Next slide. So we want to just mention, I mean, this has been a huge effort in partnership with our corporate sponsors Tenaya, as you can see, is one of our supporting sponsors, along with the other names there at the top. We couldn't do this work without all of their financial backing and support to help us provide all of this information to you. Then you see listed there all of the patient partner groups that we've worked with. And I just want to give a huge shout out of thanks to each and every one of them. They have been fantastic to work with. Some of you may have come in through some of these organizations you may be a member of, and we just really appreciate all of their support in helping promote this webinar and all of the materials that we put together on the website. And then additional partners are listed there at the bottom. Next slide. So first, a review of why we created GCAC. We realized that there was a huge problem. There is, it's estimated that 50% of cardiomyopathy cases of unknown cause actually have a genetic component to them, but only 1% of people get genetically tested. And that's a huge issue. So we developed GCAC, this consortium, and with this campaign, we hope to get the word out and really increase awareness about the link between genetics and cardiomyopathy, with a goal to help save lives of cardiomyopathy patients and their family members, as well as helping to increase the pace of genetic therapies and treatments for cardiomyopathy. Next slide. So how can you help? How can you get involved? Become knowledgeable, educate yourself, talk with your family and your doctor or doctors about genetic cardiomyopathy. Go to our website, geneticcardiomyopathy.org. And of course, we would love if you would pursue getting genetically tested, and that information can be found on our website, all of the steps, and all of the information you see tonight. A lot of that is now also on the website. I'll talk about that later. Next slide. So why should you get genetically tested? Current guidelines are recommending that your physician should suggest genetic testing if your cardiomyopathy has no known cause. And this is recommended now by the Heart Failure Society of America, the American College of Cardiology, and the American Heart Association. But not every cardiologist knows this, so this is where we need to get the word out. Knowing the gene that caused your cardiomyopathy can actually save your life. Next slide, please. So again, a little bit deeper, why get tested? It can help inform your care. Knowing if your cardiomyopathy has a genetic cause can help determine the course of treatment. Knowing the gene that you have can actually help doctors understand what kinds of treatment you should be receiving. Gene therapy advancements are coming. I mean, this is really quite remarkable. In that whole realm of cardiomyopathy, there are a number of companies working on gene therapies, and there's a lot coming down the pike. So stay tuned about that, but you need to get genetically tested to then understand if you are eligible to participate in a research study, in a clinical trial, and hopefully one day to receive some kind of gene-specific therapy. Next slide. So tonight we have with us one of our wonderful, wonderful sponsors, Tanaya Therapeutics. I was thinking back, and actually just over 3 years ago, I think it was, our very first webinar was with Tenaya, and they've come a long way, and so have we in the past 3 years. So really excited they could be with us tonight. Next slide. So I would like to introduce to you tonight's speakers. Wendy Borsari is the Senior Manager of Patient Advocacy for Tenaya. She joined Tenaya in June of 21. Prior to that, she was a consultant for pharmaceutical companies, helping them incorporate the patient voice in their work. She also worked with the SHARE registry and educated people about genetic cardiomyopathy through a number of efforts. She graduated with a degree in psychology, and she lives outside Boston with her family. Interesting note, Wendy also is a cardiomyopathy patient, and she has HCM, and she can tell you about that later. Also with us tonight, we're thrilled to have Jeff Haraldson. He's a doctor of pharmacy and has his MBA. He's the executive director of medical affairs for Tenaya. He joined Tenaya in June of 22 and has more than 20 years experience in pharma and biotech companies in med affairs and market access roles. And over the past 10 years or so, he's gained considerable experience in rare disease and gene therapy. He earned his Doctor of Pharmacy and MBA degrees from the University of Minnesota. He's worked as a clinical pharmacist with the cardiology team in Minneapolis before completing his research fellowship at the University of Michigan. Following his time there, he joined the Veteran Affairs Cooperative Studies Program in New Mexico, where he managed large multi-center studies in heart failure, renal disease, and diabetes. And he brings all of this vast experience and passion to Tanaya Therapeutics now. And we're thrilled they could both join us tonight again. And I would like to say a huge shout out to Tanaya and Wendy and her team for also helping create some new sections of the GCAC website. Without further ado, Wendy, thank you so much for being with us tonight. If you would like to take the floor, and so appreciate you being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Jayanne. We really, really appreciate this invitation to talk to everybody tonight. We were very excited with the numbers of people registering, and we, just so happy to be here to share some of the science, some of what we're doing, and also just talk a little bit about gene therapy in general. So I'm going to start by just kind of doing a deep dive into genetics 101. So if you can just go to the next slide, please. Forward-looking statement. So our legal statement that I have to put up here, and then, okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Perfect. So this is just a very simple graphic, but it tells a big story, right? So our body is made up of trillions of cells, and the cells contain the chromosomes that contain the DNA and the genes. Chromosomes live within the nucleus and are long strands of DNA. DNA is made up of genes, and every cell has approximately 20,000 genes. So genes tell our bodies how to make proteins, how to do the things our body needs to do, how to grow, how to develop, how to function. And proteins are also involved in making our organs work the way they're supposed to do. So it tells our heart how to work, tells our lungs how to work, liver, all of that. Next slide, please. But changes in genes can of course then be problematic. So a mutation, which is also known as a change or variation, is a permanent change in the DNA sequence that makes up the gene. Gene mutations can cause genetic conditions, including heart conditions, of course, such as DCM, HCM, ARVC, and such. Generally, these gene variations do not allow the cell to make the protein or to make the protein at all, or to make enough of the protein that it needs to function. And when genes are formed in the usual way, they produce the working protein that is needed. However, gene mutations can lead again to these proteins not working or not working as expected, which is considered to be or called a lack of function. In HCM, for example, the cells do not produce enough protein due to the mutation. One of them is the MYBPC3 mutation, which leads to the heart being enlarged and stiff. Two mutations that we'll discuss in the program tonight are called what's called autosomal dominant. That means you only need one copy of the gene in order to get the condition. Since you get one copy of your genes from your mom and one copy from your dad, it also means that each offspring has a 50-50 chance of developing that condition because they only need the one copy. One really important thing to mention early on in this is that gene therapy does not make changes to the person's egg or sperm cell. So the new working gene, if someone gets gene therapy, that new working gene cannot be passed on to future generations. So your child would still have a 50-50 chance of developing the condition because the gene only fixes or only works in the person who receives it, not in future generations. Next slide, please. So how do I know if I have a change in my gene? And this, I go back to what JN was talking about a little bit ago with the GCAC website. Right now, we know that nearly 50% of all of cardiomyopathies have a genetic component. The guidelines from the HFSA, the AHA, the ACA all say that when someone is suspected of having cardiomyopathy, genetic testing should be done. And the genetic testing can tell us a lot of things, right? So it can either lead you to understand that there is the presence of a genetic mutation that's confirming that regular follow-up care is therefore needed. It can show that there's an absence of that mutation. So now you know that person doesn't need to maybe go through all of that yearly follow-up that they may have if they had that if they were found to have that mutation. And then you can also find what's called, though, a genetic or a variant of uncertain significance, a VUS. And that is a variation or mutation that's identified in a gene, but it's not known whether it's the thing that's causing the genetic condition. So those can be a little bit confusing. And typically it's you're recommended to retest on a fairly regular basis if you have a VUS when you first go in for genetic testing. Next slide, please. So gene therapy is an investigational approach for genetic heart conditions. It's a technique that uses the genes to treat or prevent a disease or medical disorder, such as HCM, DCM, ARVC. Often gene therapy works by adding a new copy of a working gene to replace the function of a non-working or missing gene in a patient's cell. Once the working copy of the gene is delivered to the cell in gene therapy, the cells will now be able to make that protein that they need to do the work that they usually are supposed to be able to do. And while gene therapy has been approved to date for other diseases, for example, in the US, there is a gene therapy for a spinal muscular atrophy or SMA, and for certain inherited retinal diseases, and also in the EU for individuals with severe hemophilia A. It is investigational when looking at it from the perspective of a genetic heart condition. We're just in the very early stages of it in this. Gene therapy goes beyond treating symptoms because it addresses the root cause of the condition. Gene therapy has the potential to correct the underlying genetic cause of heart conditions, again, such as HCM, ARVC, or DCM, and others. Tenaya's gene therapy for HCM is called TN201, and it is designed to deliver a functional copy of the MYBPC3 gene to the heart. Next slide, please. So some of the goals of gene therapy. We want to treat more than just the symptoms, right? I think a lot of people on this call, there were 30 or 40%, I don't remember how many were patients. So you all know all the medications that you have to take just to treat the symptoms of your disease. But there isn't so far really any good medication out there that is actually doing something to get to the underlying cause of the condition. And that's what gene therapy hopes to do. Another goal that we hope will work is to prevent or reverse the condition. We want to be able to administer gene therapy as a one-time IV dose, and we hope that it has a long-lasting effect. So it's not something that you're going to need repeat treatments of over your lifetime. And we wanted to demonstrate meaningful improvements for the recipient in terms of your heart rhythm, your heart pump function, and your symptoms, and of course, your quality of life. And I think the next slide, we're going to go into talking a little bit about AAVs in gene therapy. And so I'm going to pass the speaking portion over to my colleague, Jeff. Thank you.
There we go. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Jan and the GCAC organization. Actually, thanks to everybody who registered and is listening in tonight. Other sponsors, medical professionals. Clearly with the numbers, there's a lot of interest in this topic. And, we're seeing this at medical congresses a lot recently too, at the HCM Society, HFSA. So gene therapies in cardiovascular conditions is really of high interest right now. And I have the honor tonight to present on a very exciting topic. Over the next half dozen slides or so, I will introduce to you AAV, or adeno-associated virus, what it is, why do we use it to deliver gene therapies, and just in general, an understanding of how it works, and then discussing some of the benefits and risks that are associated with gene therapy, and then just what's happening currently in the AAV global gene therapy marketplace. So AAV is actually the most widely used viral vector or carrier to deliver gene therapies. And so what are these vectors, or AAV, the viruses? They're actually naturally occurring in the environment. And many of us have possibly been exposed to these viruses at some point throughout our lifetime, but we wouldn't even know it. AAVs are not known to cause any symptoms or any known diseases in humans, which just makes them one of the reasons why also we use them in gene therapy. So shifting down to the why part of this is, why do we use AAV in gene therapy? Quite simply, they're very efficient and good delivery vehicles. They're successful in introducing that new working gene into our cells. And then furthermore, there are many different types of AAVs, and we refer to these different types as serotypes. And so there are some serotypes that are actually better at targeting certain tissues or cells than others. So for instance, for cardiomyopathies, we want to deliver that new working gene into the heart muscle cells, so that it allows us to select an AAV serotype that's best suited to target the heart muscle cells. And then how are these AAV vectors used for gene therapy? You can see kind of a really basic illustration on the right side of the slide, but essentially the viral DNA is removed from that protein sort of capsid or shell that you can see here on the right side, and that's removed. And then the new working gene, whatever that gene of interest might be for the specific cardiomyopathy disease, for example, is actually inserted inside of that AAV capsid. And then that AAV vector can target the cells or the tissues of interest where it needs to go. And again, leveraging the advantages of a specific AAV serotype, for example, to do that. So next slide, please. So AAV vectors contain the working gene. So what's under the hood, so to speak? What's in here? And so the contents inside of the capsid are oftentimes referred to as the gene therapy package. You might hear people say gene therapy construct, the cargo, the payload. So there's a lot of different nomenclature and naming system around this, but we'll stick with gene therapy package for purposes of tonight. And then that new working gene is inserted into the capsid. And that's sometimes, if you read the medical literature or if you're Googling, doing searches, sometimes referred to as the transgene. But that is the same as the new working gene. And so inside that capsid, besides the transgene, there are a few crucial components in that gene therapy package. And one of those that I also want to call your attention to tonight it's called the promoter. And so I guess think of a promoter as like a traffic signal or an on switch. And so that new working gene essentially contains the set of instructions that tells your cells how to make or build a specific protein, as Wendy went through in an earlier slide. So that promoter is part of this gene package that then turns on. It tells the cell that it's time to start reading those instructions and build the protein that's needed. And another sort of unique feature that's not is that these promoters can actually be designed to be selective. So in many of the cardiomyopathy gene therapies, you'll have a cardioselective promoter. So you're really trying to have your cells read the instructions and build a protein within the heart muscle cells where you really need it. So next slide, please. So this slide, entitled AAV antibody testing, it's important to talk a little bit about this topic, AAV antibody testing, and the potential for AAVs to trigger an immune response in the body. So recall that I mentioned earlier that the AAVs occur naturally in the environment, and it's possible that we've been exposed to them at some point in our lives, and we may not even know that. But our immune system is smart, has memory, and the immune system can remember that encounter. And oftentimes the immune system will develop antibodies, and specifically we refer to these antibodies as pre-existing antibodies. So if someone was exposed to an AAV earlier at some point in their lifetime, then these pre-existing antibodies may actually potentially attack that AAV gene therapy. And if that occurs, then the gene therapy may not work as well as it's intended, because essentially the immune system is doing the job that it's really designed to do, and it's trying to get rid of this sort of viral invader, and before it even gets to the target cells. So we really don't want that to happen. And in the study protocols for those who are interested and in all the AAV gene therapy trials, regardless of the disease condition, it's part of the screening process. So an individual will get their blood test to really determine that level of antibodies that are in the body. And if they're too high, then they may be at too high of a risk to have this happen, so that they wouldn't necessarily be able to participate. So it's a really important step in the gene therapy clinical trials. So next slide, please. So this is I like this slide. It's very colorful and dynamic. It looks a little busy at first, but it's a good illustration that really pieces this entire process together of gene therapy design and the delivery to the target cells. So I'll just take you through the steps. So number one, already covered, that viral DNA is removed and that working gene is inserted. And then the treatment with our approach is it's delivered intravenously through over a 2 to 4 hour infusion, most commonly. And then that infusion, and then it's able to target the muscle cells in the heart specifically. So remember back to the AAV serotypes, these different types of AAVs. So at Tenaya, for example, we're using a specific serotype, AAV9, that is well known to target muscle cell and heart muscle cell. And so once it gets into it's taken inside the cell, then that new working gene is released. And then thinking back again to that promoter. Now the promoter tells the cells, okay, time to read the instructions from that gene that was just delivered, and let's build that protein that may be low or insufficient in that certain individual. And then that may potentially help restore function to the heart muscles to treat that specific condition, that specific cardiomyopathy. So next slide, please. Always got to be talking about risks as well as the benefits. So this slide is a little bit busy, but it's important. Just as with any medication that we put into our bodies, aspirin, Tylenol, it doesn't matter. There are potential risks and side effects, and that holds true as well for AAV gene therapies. So again, just as I reviewed, our immune system may mistake that outside sort of AAV virus as an intruder, so to speak, and could trigger an immune response. And then that may potentially render the therapy not to be as effective as we want it to be. So that certainly could be a risk. Across many of the AAV gene therapies that have been completed and ongoing, one of the more common side effects that we can see is a reaction or an inflammation in the liver cells. Now, typically that's mild, it's transient, so it means it doesn't last too long. It doesn't go on to a full-blown sort of liver failure. And many times the patients don't even know that's happening. But we do on a lot of the clinical trial assessments in the blood draws, we measure certain liver enzymes, and we might notice that they're a little elevated, and individuals don't know when they're elevated at that degree, for example. And also, so currently, a person can receive AAV gene therapy only once. And for reasons that I've already previously stated, it's really all about the immune system. And so the immune system can recognize that AAV if it's given again, and the likelihood of having an immune response could be higher and trigger a prompt response, and that could lead to a lack of effectiveness. Also, it's possible that with any AAV gene therapy, it may deliver the working gene to an incorrect cell, but that in and of itself doesn't necessarily create risk. And then also, participating in an AAV gene therapy clinical trial may prevent an individual from participating in clinical trials for other gene therapies in the future. And again, it really is related all to the immune system and the body's ability to potentially attack that gene therapy and maybe not make it work as well as it should. And even if someone wants to participate in another trial with a different AAV serotype, still most of the gene therapy protocols will preclude that from happening, because there's what we call cross-reactivity between these serotypes, and the immune system could still be triggered. And then finally, just to really sum up this slide, the AAV gene therapies are still being very widely used in cardiac diseases, including cardiac myopathies and various diseases. Not all the risks are known, We're just starting off in one of our trials, for example, but we've learned a lot from a lot of the other AAV gene therapies that have been completed and are still ongoing, even from those therapies that have been approved by the FDA that continue to be monitored, and we understand the safety. So we have a really good handle on what to expect now and how to either prevent a side effect from occurring or managing certain side effects from occurring. So even though we're still exploring, we've learned an awful lot from the other trials that have been ongoing. Next slide, please. This really is somewhat redundant to Wendy's earlier slide, because she mentioned goals. If you achieve some of these key goals, those really become benefits. And I think many individuals, including their physicians and family members, believe that a one-time infusion certainly is a benefit in terms of just managing the treatment aspects of a disease. And then also another benefit is the potential for a gene therapy to stop or even reverse progression of the specific cardiomyopathy. And in these situations, if that occurs, the patient may be able to actually stop or even decrease the need for any other medications, maybe prevent going on to certain surgeries or putting in specific devices. So a whole host of collateral benefits could occur with a ability to either stop or reverse progression of the disease. And all these things really combined in totality lead to potentially an increase in quality of life. At Tenaya and our gene therapy clinical trials and in other gene therapy trials, those quality of life measurements are being measured very carefully as well. And we're really trying to get a sense of the individual's perception of change before treatment and after treatment based on how they're doing. So that's a really important piece in all this too, to look at that. So next slide, please. This is actually my last slide on this topic. And even though gene therapy may be relatively new concept to many of you, and it's a relatively new concept to many cardiologists in the entire cardiology community. But this slide, I think it's really important to point out the global experience with AAV and put that into perspective. The AAV, or adeno-associated virus itself, was discovered almost 60 years ago. And so after decades of research in the lab and in different animal models, it finally turned into, first in human clinical trials. And then actually the very first gene therapy delivered successfully to a human was almost 25 years ago now. So there's significant experience in general with gene therapy. It's now estimated that over 5,000 patients have been treated with a gene therapy. The majority of these are even children. There's a disease called spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA, and it's a rare neuromuscular condition, and well over 3,000 of children have been dosed with that gene therapy, which is actually now FDA approved. It was FDA approved a few years ago. And as of today, in the United States, at least, the FDA has approved 5 AAV-based gene therapies. Wendy mentioned some of those for a rare eye disease, a couple of bleeding disorders, hemophilia A, hemophilia B, again, this SMA that I referred to, and then more recently for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And if you've been reading the news and paying attention to this whole gene therapy space in the news, there was some exciting news recently as well for the very first CRISPR technology, or a gene editing platform, which is slightly different than what we're doing. And that has been just approved by the FDA to treat individuals with sickle cell disease. So very exciting times for gene therapies, I can't wait to see how we continue to evolve in our understanding. And as it relates to another important question around durability, or how long does this last? We now have data from patients with hemophilia, for example, that were dosed over 15 years ago now, maybe even longer. And even those children with SMA, Novartis now has that product, and they reported recently that some of these children are now out beyond 7 years since they were dosed with their one-time gene therapy. So, and just looking at the map in general, and again, I'm focusing just on AAV-based gene therapies. You can see all the clinical trials that are ongoing around the world. There are over 200 clinical trials studying gene therapies using AAV as the delivery vehicle. So a lot of excitement, a lot of research continuing. So next slide, please. Clinical trials section header, and there is one slide on that, and I will take that slide too before turning it back over to Wendy. And so here we thought it was clinical trials and the process, it's a science in and of itself sometimes. So we felt it was important just to share this slide to help understand some of the processes and where we are right now with our gene therapy clinical trials for cardiomyopathies. A term that's not on here, and I just wanted to introduce it, is something. It's called IND, or an investigational new drug, and so maybe you've seen that or heard that too. So sometimes in the news you'll hear that a company received IND clearance from the FDA. So what does that really mean? I just thought that was important because it's a really important first step before you move into these phases. And an IND application is hundreds and hundreds of pages. It contains a lot of information, how the product is made, what's in it, a lot of the preclinical work or the animal research. What does that look like? The study design, moving into patients. What are we proposing? What are the endpoints to be measured? So there's a lot of information in there. And that IND package, if you will, is delivered, or application is delivered to the FDA for their review. And if they deem the product to be safe to try in humans, then it receives IND clearance. So it's almost like a permission slip to go ahead and start testing the gene therapy in humans. So then we move into these various phases. And as you all can imagine right now, we are in mostly the phase 1 category. So this is typically small numbers of patients. Typically with more traditional medicines, you would start a phase 1 trial in healthy volunteers. But in gene therapy trials, we're not doing that. That's where there's a really pretty significant difference. So we're actually starting in patients or individuals with the disease of interest to get a good sense of safety, maybe some early efficacy signals, and then we'll take that into, and once we establish that, then we move on into the phase 2 or phase 3 trials. I wanted to also point out, because I think sometimes it gets a little confusing, and it's really on our shoulders as a sponsor of these gene therapies and sponsoring these trials. You'll see sometimes an early initiation of a gene therapy trial might be referred to as phase 1 or phase 1B or phase 1/phase 2. And all these really essentially, if you look into the detail on clinicaltrials.gov, for example, they're essentially similar designs. They tend to be open label, no placebo at this point. They tend to be dose escalating because we're taking what we believe is the best dose or an optimal dose from all the animal models now into the first in human studies. And sometimes we will test different doses to make sure we really nail that before we go on into a little bit larger studies in phase 2 or phase 3, for example. And then, of course, there's a oversight clearly with the FDA here in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, and then the European equivalent, which is called the EMA, or the European Medicines Agency. So there's a lot of, the FDA is very involved, the EMA is very involved. There's a lot of communication with the FDA back and forth throughout the trial to ensure that safety continues for all the patients who are involved. And I think that's it for me. And back over to you, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Yeah, so I will take everyone through a little bit more about the specific trials that we have either started already now or trials that we're getting into in the near future. So next slide, please. So this first one that I'm going to talk to you about is our trial for MYBPC3 associated HCM. And MYBPC3 is the gene that is most common, the most common cause of HCM, the most common genetic cause of HCM. It's found in approximately 20% of all people diagnosed with HCM. And as I mentioned previously, most of these are inherited in the autosomal dominant fashion. So this is one of the reasons why we picked this particular gene to do our gene therapy trial in. And it's also, we assume, or we estimate that at least 115,000 people in the US have this particular gene mutation as well. So it's a fairly large population of people with this mutation, and hopefully a large population of people that we can help with this. Next slide, please. So the slide or the trial name is MyPeak-1. It is a phase 1B trial. Jeff mentioned a little bit about how the phase 1 can have different names. We are calling ours the phase 1B, and it is again looking at the MYBPC3 mutation, and it is targeting the heart muscle cells or cardiomyocytes, and those are the cells that make the heart contract. And in HCM, of course, the heart is contracting too strongly. And so we are trying to help bring that protein back to the heart so the heart could contract the way it's normally supposed to contract. The problem people develop who have the MYBPC3 mutation develop HCM because they do not make enough of this protein. And so our goal, of course, is to add the working MYBPC3 gene to the cardiomyocytes to restore the expected levels of protein and allow the heart muscles to function in their usual way. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit more, a few more details about the particular study. And I'll also share a study website with you at the end of this slide, and then Jayanne will share that with you in the notes when she sends this out tomorrow. But the goal is really to study the safety and the tolerability of that single IV infusion. It evaluates the single infusion of the TN-201 in adults with the MYBPC3 mutation. And it's associated for non-obstructed cardiomyopathy at this time. The primary goal of the study is to make sure the dose we use is safe, and then it's well tolerated by the study participants, like what Jeff was just talking about. And you can find more information about this particular study at our study website, which is hcmstudies.com. We do also want to mention, obviously, that our first patient was dosed in October of 2023 for this. And so, you know, we send out our heartfelt, and we don't say that lightly, heartfelt thank you to this patient who decided to go on this journey with us and try our gene therapy. And again, you can find more information about all of the criteria, both exclusion and inclusion criteria, on the hcmstudies.com website. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the other trial that we started it's ongoing, it was started in 2022, is a non-interventional study. So that means we're not actually giving you the gene therapy. This is the study that's called a seroprevalence study that is looking at the antibodies, as Jeff has been talking about. So it's really important that we understand the antibody levels in different people with the MYBPC3 mutation, so that hopefully will feed people into this next study, right? So if we find people that have that a low enough antibody load, that they would potentially be good candidates for this study. And it was a single study visit for this, a single blood draw. And again, as I mentioned, it is ongoing at different centers around the country. And it is also, you can also learn more about that particular study at the hcmstudies.com website. Next slide, please. And the first study that we actually started was our pediatric natural history study. And natural history studies are very important because they help us understand the progression and the outcomes in a particular disease state. So this study allows us to see, we look back, 10 years for people, they're followed for 5, and on their normal yearly visit. So it doesn't have other visits, but we're able to then watch this, the disease as it progresses through these kids. We hope to enroll 200 children, and it is currently enrolling also. Again, that same website, hcmstudies.com, you can find more about this study and which sites around the country are participating in it. Next slide. So I'll now talk a little bit about the TN-401 program, which is our gene therapy for people with arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy due to the PKP2 gene mutation. Next slide, please. So again, PKP2 is the most common cause of genetic ARVC. It's approximately 70,000 people in the US have that particular mutation. So it is a fairly large number. And it also is, it's passed on in the autosomal dominant inheritance pattern. So only one copy is necessary for you to get the condition. And one thing I actually want to mention that I didn't have, it just has occurred to me, but the people that you are seeing in this slide presentation are actual patients with these mutations. And so we're also just super thankful for them, coming to us and allowing us to share a little bit about who they are and shine a face on diseases that sometimes you just don't see out there. Next slide, please. So the ARVC study is called RIDGE-1, and again, it is for PKP2 gene mutations. The target again is the cardiomyocytes, so those cells that help the heart contract, and it will add the working copy of a PKP2 gene to the cardiomyocytes to restore the expected protein levels, allowing them to then function in their usual way. And as Jeff mentioned, we got the IND clearance or the investigational new drug clearance from the FDA in October to begin trials for this to start the RIDGE-1 trial. And so that trial will be starting in 2024. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So gene therapy and whether or not to get gene therapy is a very personal decision. Discuss with your doctor if gene therapy is right for you. Cardiologists are now learning about gene therapy too. So a lot of this is going to be patients learning along with their doctors, doctors learning along with their patients. But this is a discussion that needs to happen. And so I encourage everyone to speak to your clinicians and do your research and go onto these websites, go on to the GCAC website. There's a lot of information on there, a lot of information on the study website that I shared with you, and start having these conversations because gene therapy is coming. And I know I'm super excited about it, not only from my own personal, feelings, but just because globally it is, I know it's something that is just so needed. So thank you to the DCM Foundation, to Greg and Jayanne, to GCAC for allowing us to come today and share this with all of you and teach you a little bit about gene therapy and a little bit about what Tenaya is doing. And we look forward to teaching you more and learning more from you. So thank you so very, very much.
Wonderful. Wendy and Jeff, thank you. This information is fantastic. We've all learned so much already. We have a lot of questions that are coming in. And we're going to take more questions in just a minute. I just wanted to make mention a little bit more about clinical trials. Additional gene therapy clinical trials for cardiomyopathies are coming. And we will have a webinar in the first half of next year about gene therapy and clinical trials specifically. So stay tuned for that. And the GCAC website will have additional information about clinical trials at that time. So there's so much coming. We just wanted to make mention that there are many organizations working in this space. So let's go to the next slide. Great. If folks want to drop their questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom, and Wendy and Jeff, if you want to come back on unmuted with your video, that'd be great. We have a bunch of questions that have come in already, so let me just start. And I also wanted to find out, Wendy and Jeff, if feasible, could you go till 10 past the hour, do you think?
That's fine with me.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful, because we have a lot of questions. Thank you. There's so
and
much.
I'll just throw out really quickly, if we can't get to all the questions today, please, I know Jayanne can take a screenshot or get them, and she can send them to us. She knows where to reach us, and we will make sure your questions get answered. So don't feel like, don't leave with questions unanswered.
Thank you. Thank you so much for mentioning that, Wendy. So the first question I'd like to ask, assuming gene therapy has received approval, in your opinion, are there benefits to administering gene therapy at an earlier age? And is there an optimal window for intervention in cardiomyopathy? I'll just go on just briefly. With the promising results regarding durability, would it be better to dose at the first signs of phenotype expression, or do you think we should wait until the disease has progressed a little? And either of you, whomever, would like to answer that.
Jeff, do you want to take that one?
I'll take a step. Sure. I mean, it's a great question. It's an important question. I think the probably the best answer to that is yes. I think for gene therapy to probably have its best impact, in my opinion, would be to initiate before phenotype. I think finding that really magic window, that therapeutic window, is yet to be determined. But if you take that on the opposite end of the spectrum, for example, and you are going to dose an individual with extreme amounts of, cardiac fibrosis, or really, really burnt out hearts, for example, then I think the likelihood of having the same effect, may be diminished. Are we able to reverse fibrosis? No, I don't think so. So I think there's definitely a window in age and phenotype onset that it's probably more ideally suited. Now, just based on where we are in our trials, we're starting out in the adult population first to establish efficacy or safety first in any efficacy signals.
That's great. And that leads me to a follow-up question. There were a couple of related questions to this. Is it thought that gene therapy can reverse damage to the heart? Can it actually reverse the damage?
I think depends on what is meant by damage. And
right.
We've seen in a lot of our preclinical models, LV mass, the hypertrophy, ejection fractions, even some of the arrhythmia burden. Lots of these things are actually reversed with the gene therapy. So I think when you get into some of the different manifestations of the disease, and again, I'll call out fibrosis as probably one of those. But otherwise, I think for the, many of the disease manifestations do have the potential to be reversed.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, excellent. There were a couple of related questions about how often folks should get retested if, for example, their genetic testing showed a negative result, or a VUS, which is variant of
unknown significance.
Unknown significance, right?
Yeah, sorry. So how often is it recommended? Because, we know that there are more genes known now that can cause cardiomyopathy than there were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So the evolution is ongoing. How often would you recommend people consider being retested?
Yeah, another really important question. Oh, go ahead, Wendy.
Yeah, I was going to say, so a lot of that information is on the GCAC website, I believe. But I think they generally recommend, if you have a VUS, to test approximately every 5 years, I think, or so. So I would recommend that. And if there is a family history, you might be the first person in the family with the mutation, right? So if they test other people in the family, maybe they don't find the mutation because you're the patient number one. And then if that's passed on, then as we know more about genetics, as we see more mutations, it is good to be retested, I think, so I don't know that for someone who has not been found with a VUS, I don't know if there's a particular time frame that they say to be retested, but that's a discussion I think that's really important to have with your clinician on a regular basis. Just when do they think it might make sense for you to be retested? And I anticipate that more clinicians are going to be testing more than they did in the past, because I just don't think we have been doing enough testing overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like there really is becoming a groundswell of understanding and awareness in this area, in general, among cardiologists and so forth. So this is a more specific question, but I'm sure on a lot of people's minds. Can you remain on all of your current medications during a gene therapy trial? Are there additional medications that you need to take?
So, good question. I think sometimes if there's another investigational drug that maybe it may be out there, we don't want other investigational drugs on board in someone's body when we're trying to test something new. So for as far as beta blockers and calcium channel blockers, a lot of those sort of standard of care therapies, one of the most important things is to be on stable doses for a few months prior to getting the gene therapy, so that we're not fluctuating and changing doses. But sometimes there are requirements not to be on specific medications, and protocols will point those out specifically for the participants.
Okay, excellent. Specific question, for the HCM studies, can you be genotypically positive for other HCM related genes in addition to MYBPC3 to participate?
Yeah, another great question. And as of right now, we are just looking, we want to look at it a little bit more in a kind of a pure approach. So we want to look at just MYBPC3 pathogenic or likely pathogenic mutations, just so that it doesn't confuse the results potentially of the individual therapy. So at least early on right now, at least from our approach, we're looking at just a monogenic disease, for example.
Okay. Okay, good to know. Thank you. There are a few questions related to what clinical trials are available with regards to genetic therapies for various genetic mutations that can cause cardiomyopathy. And my first answer is I recommend people go to clinicaltrials.gov to, do research and identify all the trials that are available. I don't think that between us, we could come up with necessarily a complete list in the moment. But are there other variants that are known that you know of that have gene therapy trials going on besides MYBPC3 or PKP2? Sorry. Any additional gene therapy trials that you happen to have heard of?
And I agree with you, Jayan, that if you go on to clinicaltrials.gov, the search engine is pretty good. They actually just modified it too. So you can plug in the disease state. So for example, you could be really generic and plug in cardiomyopathy, for example. And then in another search term, you could put in gene therapy and you'll get a hit of a number of trials long. So you can kind of look at the different things that are out there. Now, in this setting, I'll give you the personal example from Tenaya. So our TN401 gene therapy for PKP2 associated arrhythmogenic ventricular cardiomyopathy, it was just recently cleared from the with an IND. We don't have it up on clinicaltrials.gov yet. So sometimes there's a little lag and it may not be real-time accuracy, but it's generally a pretty good resource. Also, I think, Wendy, maybe like the patient advocacy groups, HCMA, for example, things like that,
Right.
have pretty good understanding.
Yeah, I think the patient advocacy groups are great to reach out to and find out, because sometimes they also kind of have an idea of what's coming down the pike, right? What they've heard might be starting trials. And the clinicaltrials.gov too, which is really interesting, is it's not just US studies. So you will find studies from around the world listed on that, and you can refine your search as tightly as you want to, or you can keep it as broad as you want to, and it's gonna provide a lot of information. So, and it's a little easier. It used to be really not user-friendly at all. It has gotten a little bit better. So yeah, you should be able to find some great information on there.
Okay, excellent. Is there a collective effort among Tenaya and other gene therapy companies to push insurers to cover gene therapies? Interesting question.
Yeah, we're not pushing insurers yet. I mean, I think there are so many variables that go into that. We have what are called health tech assessment organizations. There's so much research that goes into trying to identify like a true like value of the potential product. So I think all the companies work very closely with the insurance companies, the payer organizations, so that they understand the potential benefits of the therapy, the overall value proposition, if you will. And so I think it just takes time to do that. But I think with 5 FDA approved gene therapies right now, and actually sickle cell disease just had 2 therapies approved by the FDA on the same day. One of those I mentioned earlier with the CRISPR technology. I think the payer market is getting more and more used to seeing this. So I can't comment too much more on that, but I think we're definitely, it's a very important partner in all this for sure.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. Courtney says, I am a cardiovascular genetic counselor. Welcome, Courtney. We're glad you could join us tonight. For VUS genetic test results, you can always contact your genetic counselor or the genetic testing lab to request updated information on the classification without necessarily having to redo the test. That's great to know. I ask my patients with suspicious VUS results to call me once each year to discuss any updates. So that's fantastic to know. Thank you for shedding light on that.
Thank you, Courtney.
That's wonderful. Yeah, people are thanking you, Courtney. So that's great. And then there was a question. someone who's been genetically tested in Europe, wondering if they would have different results with the US or Canadian tests. Can either of you shed any light on that? I'm not sure if that's within the scope of your knowledge.
With a genetic test?
With a genetic test, yeah.
Courtney?
Yeah.
I wouldn't think so. It's going to be the same panels that are being tested. If you're doing a cardiomyopathy panel, I would, I would assume that would be the same, but, neither of us are genetic counselors or geneticists. So that's something to talk to your genetic counselor about.
And anyone, by the way, who's asking, is there a specific study for gene therapy for some sort of specific gene? Again, I recommend go to clinicaltrials.gov. That's where you're going to get your most updated information. We have a few questions that are gene specific. I am thrilled with all of these questions. Everyone is fascinated and interested in this topic, and this is really exciting. I will just again put a shout out for anyone who hasn't been genetically tested. Please do make sure that you go to talk with your doctor. And if you have been tested, talk to your family. If you've already been tested and you know your genetic mutation, talk to your family, try to encourage them to get tested, because this is all predicated on people having the knowledge of what their genetic mutation is in the first place. So we want to make sure and still encourage everyone get tested. Someone asked about the risks of gene therapy. That was covered in the early part of the presentation, but again, I'll send the recording of the webinar out to everyone tomorrow, so you'll get a copy of that. Let's see, there are a lot of questions coming in here. Let's see, one other question. Are there long-term monitoring requirements that we know of for people who have had genetic therapy, gene therapy?
Yes, there are going to be. Our trials have a 5-year follow-up. I don't know about other trials that have already, started or for other conditions. But it is something that we need to follow. Any therapy that you take, whether it's a small molecule, pill or something like that, there is going to be follow-up, because they need to see, the FDA wants to see not only does that therapy work now, does it work in a year, but does it continue to have the same effects, and do other things happen down the line. So there is always some sort of follow-up time. And again, in our 2 trials, it's a 5-year follow-up.
Okay, excellent. An interesting specific question. Do you know what % of study applicants fail the antibody test?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that one.
It is a really good question. We did a seroprevalence study. We refer to it as a phase 0 study for our HCM trial. And we actually published some of that data at the HCM Society in October. We had about 75% of the patients would qualify. And so that's really a pretty decent result. So I think it related to our specific AAV serotype in the actual population. So that gives you kind of a sense of where things may fall.
And then the follow-up is, are there alternative therapies other than AAV being investigated for patients who may test positive for the antibodies?
So there are other, like, non-viral vectors that are being investigated. They're not to the point where we are today with our HCM trial. But, there are a lot of research is going on with, like, lipid nanoparticles, for example, that could encapsulate the gene. So there are different things there's different research that's being explored now to try to minimize those aspects or challenges of a clinical trial. But we still have a little ways to go before they really get to this stage.
Okay, wonderful. And a follow-up question about insurance. People, of course, are very interested in how this works. And this will be the last question. And any that I didn't get to, we'll go back and talk with Wendy and Jeff and see if we can get the answers to all of those. But this is again about the insurance. Are these HCM gene therapies covered by medical insurance companies? So have you heard anything back from patients about that?
So
Yeah, there's only currently the one trial, and it's a trial, right? So there's
Trial.
nothing that insurance is not touched for a trial. Everything is paid for by the sponsor. So you wouldn't have to worry about insurance issue by being a part of the trial. And of course, the whole trial has to happen, and then you have to get the FDA, and then the next phases of the trial, and then the FDA approval before the drug would then come to market. So there's, many more years that we're looking at before that happens. At that point, then the insurance question really comes to play. But we're a ways away from that now. But to participate in a trial, you don't need to worry about insurance. That's not.
And that's a great point. That's a great point. Thank you for that, Wendy. We do have one comment before I'm going to wrap up and then go back to the deck. We have a few more slides with some important information, so don't go anywhere yet. This gal Colleen says, I am a cardiogenetic counselor as well, and there could be differences between US and Europe, how the test was interpreted and what genes were included in particular. So for that person, they may want to follow up on that with their doctor. So I am going to pause the Q&A and just give a huge shout out to you both. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Jeff. This has been fascinating. I'm always excited. I mean, how fast things have come so far. I mean, in some ways it feels like forever, I'm sure, for patients, but it's really so promising. And that's why we said, this holds the hope for the future. So thank you both for all of your time and information tonight. And we're just thrilled to work with you and Tanaya. So, and thank you for all your support.
Thank you so much. We really loved being here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. And Justine, if we can go back to the deck, just a few more slides. First, I think if we go back one slide. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We're good. Yep, we're good. That was my error. Again, for more information, you can go to geneticcardiomyopathy.org. We have a new tab on the website. If you go to genetics and cardiomyopathy, there's information there about the basics of genetics and the basics of gene therapy. Please read through that. It's really fascinating information. And again, we encourage you to talk to your family about getting tested, talk to your doctors about getting tested, information that you can find there as well on the website. Next slide. There are a number of gene-specific websites and online groups that are in existence that I want to make sure if you have Lamina, Titan, Bag3, DSP, there are specific websites you can visit and Facebook groups you can join. I highly encourage you to do so. Please visit laminacardiac.org. They have incredible information there if you have the Lamina genetic mutation. Please visit Team Titan at titanmyopathy.com. It's another wonderful organization if you have the Titan gene. And there are gene-specific Facebook groups now. There's a group for Bag3, DSP, Titan, and Lamina. So please, you just go into Facebook and just look up Bag3 group, DSP group, and you can find those groups. And I'll also include links in the follow-up email. Next slide. Thank you again to our generous sponsors, without whose support we simply wouldn't be here. So really wonderful. And thank you. Huge thanks to Tanaya for tonight's presentation and partnership. We just really appreciate the ongoing partnership with them and all the great work they do. Next slide. And I would like to make mention, we always recommend for cardiomyopathy patients to seek specialized care in a heart failure or heart transplant center. And to find a center near you, you can simply Google Heart Transplant Center near me. Or if you need help, please email Adam Burkhart. He is our Director of Patient Services. You can reach him at aburkhart@dcmfoundation.org. Next slide. And save the date for our next webinar, January 17th, 2024. Stay tuned for more information, and we will provide that to you just as soon as we have it. So thank you all. Happy holidays. Thanks for being with us tonight. And again, reference the website, geneticcardiomyopathy.org, to your family members, to your doctors, get the word out, and Stay safe and be well. Happy holidays, everyone. Thanks for being with us tonight. Take care now.